Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the speakers series once again. Tonight's guest is Ruiping from Alberta Wildlife Association. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge as non-Indigenous settlers with privilege that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Eyahi, Nakota, which include the Bearspaw, Chiniki, Wesley Nations, and the Métis Nation 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. And with that, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker tonight. Ruiping has been working with, she's with the Alberta Wilderness Association, which is in its 60th year. And I'd like to invite Ruiping to actually explain what she does there and something about the association. Many of us are aware of this, but many of us are not. So I'm going to hand it over to Ruiping and let her take the show, and then there will be room for questions following this. Thank you, Ruiping.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. So AWA, the Alberta Wilderness Association, is a conservation-focused association. We work mostly in advocacy and education, so a lot of responses to policy, a lot of trying to let people know what's going on and trying to get the information to where we feel it really needs to be. Our mandate is that we want protected areas. We want protected areas that are representative, and we want protected areas that are connected. And as part of that, it is mostly about the wild spaces, but also about the wildlife in them. So that brings me here tonight to talk a little bit about what's going on in Alberta with our wildlife and with our wildlife management. I want to talk mostly about a couple of decisions that have been made in the last year that really affect our wildlife species and especially our predators. And for each of these decisions, I want to talk about what some of the justification behind them was according to the government, some of the evidence we found for the justification and for these decisions, what biologists have been saying when we've spoken to them. And I also want to talk a little bit about consultation and timelines for each of these decisions and on some things that we can do or that we're trying to do to react to these decisions. But before I get into all of that, I want to talk first about biodiversity. So basically, why do we even care? Why is it important that we have these wild animals on the landscape? Well, firstly, many people enjoy just having them there. They're very charismatic, important species, but they're also important because they are vital for a healthy ecosystem. And when I talk about a healthy ecosystem, what I mean is an ecosystem that is robust, resilient, and functional. And wildlife is really important for a lot of ecosystem function and services. So things like soil aeration, loosening of the soil, things like pollination services, things like nutrient cycling, air purification and removal of pollutants from the air, pest control, especially of invasive or harmful insects and other organisms, water filtration, so again, removal of toxins, and seed dispersal. And wildlife are important for all of these services, and these services in turn are really important for a lot of the things that we rely on. They're important in supporting things like agriculture, things like human health, our economy, and also for buffering against natural disasters. So predators in particular are really vital to ecosystems. Predators help to control prey populations. And through their control of prey populations, they have cascading effects on other parts of the ecosystem. For instance, vegetation, by reducing grazing to a manageable level. They're also important in terms of competition between other species. So for instance, they can reduce the abundance of one species, which affects how competitors of that species react, and they can allow species that otherwise might be rare or less common to become more abundant. They're vital for nutrient cycling, so through their kills and also through movement. And they help to control disease because predators really target the weaker organisms. And so those organisms are the ones that are usually more likely to be infected and less resistant. So how are we managing these wildlife? Before I get into that, though, there's some terms that I'll be using a lot throughout this presentation that I just want to make sure everyone understands. The first one is harvest. So whenever I talk about harvest, I'm referring to any purposeful removal of an animal. That can be hunting, trapping, it can be other methods. The second one is quota. So this is the maximum number of animals that can be harvested. Alberta actually has a slightly different quota system for hunting and for trapping. So for hunting, it's usually per wildlife management unit, which I'll talk about in a second. For trapping, it's per trap line. So hunting, I'll usually be referring to quotas that are across the province, usually for residents. Trapping is more for a specific area. And then the last thing is WMUs, which are wildlife management units. These are areas that are managed for a specific species and for harvest of that species. Cougars are on a bit of a different system. They have a cougar management unit, which is an area that cougars can be hunted during the winter season. So this is a map of the WMUs in Alberta. You can see it covers most of the province except for parks, and this is the basis on which most wildlife management decisions are made. So going into some of these decisions that I keep referring to, let's start with cougars. Last year, female quotas were more than doubled. So if we look at the quotas for cougars before and after this change, here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looked like after. So you can see the female cougar numbers went from 32 to 72. The second major change was that new cougar management areas were established. Here's again the map before the change, and here's where it went. So if we're looking at the changes, there were expansions up north, expansions south and east, and then into the more isolated cougar subpopulations at Cypress Hills. All in all, these expansions mean that the area that cougars could be hunted was almost doubled. So the problem with expanding area is that now there are fewer places for cougars to escape from hunting and to recover away from hunting pressure. And then the final change was a smaller one, but off-leash dogs, which previously weren't allowed in parks, were now being allowed to hunt cougars. So why were these changes made? Well, some of the reasons given was that cougar populations had reached 2,000 cougars, but we want 1,500. That the acceptable cougar harvest rate was 20%, but current rates are just over half of that. And that there's been increasing negative interactions between humans and cougars, and that this change would help to decrease conflict. This is not quite what the evidence shows. So in 2019, Alberta estimated there were 1,559 cougars. Of those, 795 were adults. Also, the 1,500 individuals that they talk about, that's the minimum sustainable population. That is not the target for the cougar population. And as you might have noticed, we're already very close to that minimum. On harvest rates, so 20% is actually the maximum of all human-caused mortality, not just hunting, but also trapping, also accidental kills, also purposeful landowner removals. The actual harvest rate is 14 to 60% of the adult population only. And if you do the math, that works out to about 110 to 130 cougars, and actually the quota last year for residents was already higher than our target harvest rate. And in fact, quotas were reduced back in 2022 because they were trying to meet these harvest rate targets and because they were trying to manage them sustainably. And finally, on negative interactions. So we've actually seen fewer problem cougars killed recently. If you look at the cougar mortality in Alberta data that's published on the Open Government website, we've seen a decline in the number of problem cougars that have needed to be removed. And in fact, most research shows that hunting usually increases conflict with cougars. We've seen this a lot in studies in the States and in other provinces, but also in Alberta, again looking at the cougar mortality. In years where there's been higher human-caused cougar mortality, whether that's hunting or trapping or anything else, there's been more problem cougars that needed to be dealt with. So when we spoke to biologists, they agreed with this. They said that these changes generally have not been supported by the current framework or science, and they have the potential to reduce our population of cougars. So just talking a little bit about the timeline. We heard about the cougar quota increases and the establishment of new cougar management areas back in March, but they waited until December to actually specify what the new quotas were in these new areas. And December 1st is also when the cougar hunting season opens. So the result is basically that there was no time for anyone to react to these new changes before the hunting season started. And we also didn't see any consultations. Consultations that did occurred with hunters. And in fact, these changes coincide with the Wild Sheep Foundation's cougar bounty, and specifically on the harvest of female cougars. So why do we actually care if we lose our cougars? What happens if we lose our cougars? Well, there's been some research that shows cougars have quite a bit of impact on the rest of the ecosystem, especially on riverbanks. There was a study in the States that showed that where there were more people, there were less cougars. And as a result of there being less cougars, there were more deer. And with more deer, there were less cottonwoods, because deer like to browse, especially the young cottonwoods. Cottonwoods are really important for riverbank stabilization. So the result was that with less cottonwoods, there was more erosion of the riverbanks, and so lower biodiversity and degradation of the riparian, aquatic, and nearby terrestrial ecosystem. So cougars do have quite an important role in the ecosystem. Next group that I wanted to talk about was grizzly bears. So grizzly bear hunting had been suspended since 2006. Almost 20 years later, they allowed hunting of problem grizzly bears. They allow hunting of grizzly bears if the bear is involved in a human-bear conflict situation or an area of concern. There's not a clear definition that we've been able to find of what an area of concern means. And I do want to note that this is an exception. This is the only hunting currently allowed of a threatened species. So again, asking why? Well, grizzly bear populations, we were told, has increased from about 800 to 1,150 bears. We've been told there were 104 attacks in roughly 20 years between 2000 and 2021. And that there are about 20 grizzlies killed each year from negative human interactions. So, looking a little closer into this, back in 2010, based on DNA studies, there were roughly 691 bears. At about 2016, the estimate was 865 to 973 bears. These results were published in 2021 based on surveys between 2004 and 2018. And the first thing I want to note is that these estimates are considered outdated. According to the recovery strategy, we should be looking at redoing these surveys every 5 years. So these surveys are all over 5 years old at this point, and there doesn't appear to be a plan to get more updated data. And the other thing to note is that we generally want to aim for about 1,000 mature bears to consider the population recovered. And bears mature fairly late. So there's roughly half the population is mature bears. That means that we need a total population of over 2,000 to reach that goal. And we have not received any information on where these new estimates are coming from or what information they're basing it off of. On attacks, Parks Canada showed that they responded to 6 grizzly bear attacks between 2010 and 2023. There were a total of 8 fatal bear attacks between 1990 and 2023, and I do want to note that neither of these would give a complete record of all the bear attacks in the province, but there does seem to be quite a big gap between the numbers that we've found and what the government has reported. And again, we have not been able to identify or have not received any information on where these numbers are coming from. On the grizzly interactions, according to the published bear mortality rates, there's about 4 to 6 deliberate removals. So usually these are problem bears that need to be euthanized. There are also bears killed from things like vehicle strikes in self-defense and other illegal or accidental kills. But on the removals themselves, the deliberate removal of problem bears, there's much less than 20. And I do want to note that the Alberta Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan, which was published in 2020, talks about trying to coexist with bears. It doesn't recommend removing bears from areas where there's high conflict. Again, speaking with biologists, none of this seems to be backed by science, and wildlife management really should be science-based. So, of all the decisions that I'm going to talk about today, this was the one decision that was actually announced formally, 3 weeks after the change was made. Again, there was no consultation with biologists, with the public, with any of the indigenous nations. And we actually have a warning because previously the Ungava population of grizzly bears, which roamed most of eastern Canada, that is considered extinct now, and mostly that was attributed to overhunting. So we don't want to see that happen here as well, and this is why we need to be careful with hunting of grizzly bears. The next thing I wanted to talk about was fur bearers. So the one major decision that was made was that trapping limits on fur bearers, specifically on wolverine, river otter, Canada lynx, and fisher, which are sensitive species, were set to unlimited. So this is what the limits looked like before the change, and again after the change. And the main reason given by the government on this was that we didn't have enough information, there was no justification for the quota, and we needed to collect data on the affected species. This statement actually contradicts with some of the previous statements and reports that the government of Alberta has released. For instance, the Alberta Guide to Trapping Regulations notes that we need accurate data to manage these species and to establish quotas. The harvest data analysis conducted in 2001, this was also released by the government, concluded that trapping data by itself was not accurate and was not a good way to estimate populations, and it really needs to be independently verified. In fact, most of the data that was available before this decision was made shows that trapping is unsustainable for most of these species and needed to be lowered. So, wolverine is one of the species affected by this change. And wolverines, we've known for a long time that they are a species that has very low density in Alberta and fairly low populations. In 2024, there was an update that we have a total of 955 individuals in the province and about 544 adults. There were also several studies released between 2020 and 2022 that wolverine trapping is too high to be sustainable in the province. And we know that trapping is one of the main causes of mortality in this species. Most of the wolverine biologists have said that they are against this decision, that wolverines have low resilience, and there are concerns that if we overtrap, then we will lose wolverines from areas of the province. Another species affected was fisher. So Alberta publishes a fisher tooth analysis every year, and recently the juvenile to female ratios are declining. What this means is that for each female fisher, there have been fewer cubs, and that means the population is growing at a much slower rate. In fact, we're now below what they targeted, which means that the population is not growing fast enough to justify the trapping quotas that have been set. And again, these species are highly sensitive to trapping. We think that one of the reasons BC's population is likely declining is because of trapping. River otter, another species that is highly sensitive to overharvest. And in fact, we're lost from most of southern Alberta due to overtrapping and only recovering with reintroductions, with extensive efforts at recovery and the introduction of quotas. And again, biologists that we spoke to were expressed concerns that this is going to be harmful to the recovery of the species and could again extirpate them from areas of southern Alberta. Last species that was affected by these changes is the Canada lynx. Trapping again is a significant source of mortality, and a lot of the past range shrinkage, so losses of Canada lynx from certain areas, has been attributed to overharvest. As a scientist, usually we try to follow the precautionary principle, which basically means that if we don't have enough information and there's an action that could cause harm, we should wait to act until we have enough information. So if we don't have enough information on fur bearers, the appropriate action would be to stop trapping until we have that information, not to open it up. And as also noted here, trappers are not wildlife managers, and management should really be carried out by knowledgeable, experienced biologists. So again, I just want to take a look at the timeline, and similar to the cougar timeline, these limits were removed November 1st, which is again when the trapping season began for wolverine and fisher. And as before, there was no time to really react to these changes. But this specifically also is in violation of Alberta's wildlife regulation, which is a regulation the minister should be responsible for upholding. And this has not been corrected despite us alerting the minister of this problem. Consultations, again, no public consultations that we're aware of. The only consultation was with the Alberta Trappers Association, and we found that they had multiple discussions for about a year or over a year before this decision was made. The government has admitted that they have little understanding of fur bearer populations. When asked how they were going to manage this and make sure that there wasn't overharvest, they said they were working with the Alberta Trappers Association and with the Alberta Conservation Association. And these are both associations that have a lot of hunter engagement. There has been no planned engagement with wildlife experts, and they have said they're not planning to speak with biologists in the future regarding this issue. So just a quick segue, I wanted to talk a little bit about mesopredators. So most of the fur bearers that are affected are mesopredators, and they're a little bit different from the apex predators that we often focus on. So mesopredators are usually smaller, and unlike the apex predators, which generally go after the larger ungulates and other mammals and prey species, mesopredators are really important in controlling small mammals and birds. They're also really important in affecting, like the apex predators, the plant communities and the remainder of the community by affecting the distribution and the abundance of target species. There are also a lot of mesopredators are scavengers. So they're really important in the nutrient cycle, and they're also important in moving nutrients between ecosystems. River otter, for instance, spends a lot of its time in both the aquatic water system and terrestrial and land systems. So they will move nutrients between these systems. And then the final thing I want to touch on is a few other species. We've mostly talked about predators, but there was one other decision that was made, and that was the Minister's Special License was changed. So this is a license that allows hunting outside of the quotas already set for each area. And the Minister's Special License was expanded to include 4 additional species: white-tailed deer, mountain goat, cougar, and bison. And in 2022, it was also expanded to allow year-round hunting. So the species we're specifically worried about is mountain goats. This is because there were already significant declines, mostly from overharvest, and some of these populations have still not recovered. One thing mountain goats do to escape predation is that they will flee to rocky ledges. And as you can imagine, this isn't as effective when you're dealing with bullets and arrows. So because of that, human hunting might have a greater effect than other predators. They are, again, highly sensitive to harvest, and in fact, there was a study that showed many of Alberta's populations are already at risk of extinction. So, again, biologist statements agreed that they're very sensitive to overharvest, and there was no scientific basis, and that these decisions might impact whether or not we still have mountain goat populations in the future. So just to conclude, there were several changes that essentially opened up the province to hunting and trapping. These changes were not based in science, they are against the advice of wildlife biologists, and they were made without broad consultation. These changes threaten Alberta's wildlife. They are at the point where they are threatening overharvest, and they are threatening whether or not we will have these species in these areas in the future. So we believe that wildlife management must follow the best available science, that it should reflect the interests of the public, and it should support long-term ecological health. We're not seeing that with these decisions. So because of that, we have asked that these decisions be rescinded. So if you are interested in getting involved, we have put our open letter and appendices on these decisions at the website provided. I can also drop that link in the chat in a second. And reach out to your MLA, reach out to Minister Loewen, try to express your concern. We also do have an official petition that we've worked on. We are hoping to present this in legislature in the fall. Alberta's petitions, we do need the original signatures, so we're asking people to either come in or to mail in the petition if you're interested. It is also at that website on the side. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you, Ruiping, for a pretty marvelous PowerPoint, amazing presentation. I mean, it's real clean, clear, it's beautiful as well, but informationally, it's pretty stark and black and white. And it's wonderful that you've ended off in the way in which you have, the take action portion there, because that's when presentations are made to any of us, anybody sitting around a table right now is concerned in this issue and many other related or unrelated, for that matter, issues concerning the government, always knows what to do, which is the big challenging part of it all. And once again, your mantra, as with anybody else who speaks to us on a variety of concerns, is that, as you've echoed so well, science does not seem to be a part of the decision making, that experts are really to be feared, not to be involved, because they might actually offer contrary information. So I guess I'm not so much asking a question as congratulating on you for such a fine presentation.
Thanks. And yeah, I also wish I had better news to share, but this is what's going on, and I didn't want to sugarcoat it. But thank you for speaking out, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of this group.
Yeah, again, this is more of a statement than a question, really. Um, my understanding is that the rules have been changed in such a way that even though Todd Loewen's family owns outfitting businesses and he used to run the business, etc., this is not against the rules. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I wanted to focus on the facts here, but we have spoken out that we feel there is a conflict of interest in that Minister Loewen's, he has a strong background with trappers. He's maintained a lot of close relationships with these trappers, and his outfitting company is currently owned by his wife and son. So they are, this is not at arm's length. This is directly affecting his business essentially, or his family's business. And whenever he is challenged on this, his response is that the ethics commissioner has cleared him of being in a conflict of interest. And I don't know all the details in how that happened or what exactly the conditions were, but it does seem like currently the conclusion of the ethics commissioner has been that this is not a conflict of interest. That's a conclusion we strongly disagree with. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what happened there or how that happened. We have brought up several times that we think there is still a conflict of interest here, even if the ethics commissioner thinks there isn't.
Would it be impolite to suggest that the ethics commissioner might fear for their job if they made an adverse ruling?
It's certainly something that's come up is because if you look at the conflict of interest definitions, and in fact we do go into that in our appendices if you want to look at the evidence we've gathered on the conflict of interest. If you look at the definitions for Alberta, it does include things like adult children and how it affects their interests. So we think that's a pretty clear indication that there's a conflict. I think that's a question that you should be asking the ethics commissioner.
I have a couple of questions. But first off, is CPAWS and the Warden Service, they've spoken out vehemently, I suppose, opposing these changes to the legislations?
You know, I actually haven't heard a lot from CPAWS. I think they've been focused on other issues. I've mostly been working with John Marriott and Exposed Wildlife Conservancy, so I haven't heard a lot from CPAWS or where they are at with these issues.
Thank you. The other question I had was, what about the hunting lotteries that this government has introduced? I mean, this is, to me, that's totally problematic. It's putting a price on everything in Alberta, and I think it's absolutely atrocious. I mean, hunting with dogs is bad enough. I came from Ontario years ago, 50 years ago, and there they allowed them to hunt deer with dogs. So they would run deer into a valley and they'd have people staggered across on either side of it and shoot them. It was like a shooting gallery. I mean, there's no sport, there's nothing, there's no, it's just absolutely a killing field. I'm really concerned about these hunting lotteries. It's putting a price on wildlife. It's in an invasive way, and it sends a message to the rest of the world that we're a bunch of.
I'm not sure, but I think some of those might have been earlier because we've always had some hunting. Whether or not previous decisions were more based in science is debatable to an extent. So, yeah, I guess I don't really know enough about the hunting lotteries to know exactly what's going on. I do know that the minister's special license has been promoted internationally.
Yes.
So that's very much raising funds that are supposedly for conservation, although I would challenge that based on where the funds sometimes end up. I guess I don't think I can answer your question about the lotteries because I don't know quite enough about how that system works or where it started or where it's coming from. If anytime it mostly goes back to we want any wildlife management decisions to be science-based, and we want them to be reflective of broad public interests, not a specific group.
Some of the concerns that I'm hearing at Cochrane Ecological are that, first of all, there's been no clear definition about what a problem bear is. And from the research in the past that many wildlife rehabs and ecological institutes have done, it's something extraordinary, like 98% of problem bears are problem humans. And so because we don't have a definition of that, if some bear wanders into your garden because you've left your garden available, or you left garbage out, that could be considered a problem bear. Even if there are bylaws in place saying you must, like in Canmore and Banff, you must not keep open garbage out, you must not have plants and things like that. So, and they're not being fined for this. The other issue that I've come across, so Ruiping, I don't know if you've heard any new information, but the studies on population have been based on basically parks or Fish and Wildlife going out, or parks people going out and looking at an area and saying, well, this area in this given place could possibly hold 10 dens, without even seeing bears, without even actually tagging or doing scientific-based research. They're justifying it on what the population or the percentage of denning opportunities might be available in this area. And there's all this new technology now with AI that you can actually you can identify a single bear from a species by voice imprint. So with these new recording machines, with any species, you can record them, and not every cougar is going to sound the same, so that those machines can actually identify how many different cougars have been heard in an area, or how many different bears. And yet the government and Fish and Wildlife and parks are not yet at that place. So that's another reason, in my mind, that we have actually no population estimates that are based on anything more than perhaps occasional sighting, or estimates on how many dens could hold bears in a given area. And as you said, I mean, grizzly bears take a minimum of 3 years to have a baby. So at 1 every 3 years, we're really in trouble.
I was curious if the Alberta Wildlife Association has had any consultation with Indigenous communities and elders about what their thoughts are. I know, some may still be engaging in things like trap lines and so on and so forth. But I also know that, Indigenous tradition is to not over hunt, not over use, and be really thoughtful about land management. So I'm just curious if your organization has had any opportunity to have any
A
conversations.
few, mostly contacts that we have. So we have reached out to people we know who are involved, especially in the north, where more of this is going on. And yeah, similarly, we've mostly heard concerns about overhunting and overtrapping, and some about a lack of consultation, but also that they're prioritizing settler hunting. A lot of Indigenous nations are also very overwhelmed with all of the things that are going on, but those are the concerns that we've heard. If there's other people that you think we could speak to and who might be interested in working with us, I'd love to know.
Ruiping, just out of interest, what kind of organizations do you want to work with?
There's power in numbers. So
Exactly.
right now I just feel like this hasn't really been talked about a lot. And even sometimes I speak to biologists who are not dealing with these species or are outside of this area, and they're not aware of it. And they're shocked when they learn that all of this has happened. But I think right now it's just getting the message out. I'd love to reach more of the hunters and trappers, because I know there are people in there who are very concerned with conservation. I know there are hunters who do value the wildlife, and they are also concerned with these decisions, and I'd love to talk to that group. I'd also be interested in talking to rural people who maybe are concerned with the, for instance, problem bears or with cougars. And I want to appreciate that those are real concerns, but I'd like to think that there's a better way of coexistence than just killing all of our predators. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think any organization that's interested in working with us, we'd love to talk to and just share our concerns, talk about what we can do together. But I'd also be interested in trying to reach those groups that maybe aren't aware of this or have a different perspective.
What about a concerted media strategy to get newspapers more involved in this, and of course, different supporting groups as well to raise awareness? What about putting together, doing some brainstorming and putting together a group that will actually focus on the issues and bring it out and get media to come in and partake in those?
That's a good idea. We have had a little bit of media attention on this, not on our letter itself, but on individual decisions. And it's like, I agree that that's what we need to do, is we need to get the information out there. I think it's just, there's a lot going on right now.
Ruiping, is there any truth to some of the statements that I've heard were said that they're increasing the hunting on bears and cougars because for meat?
Honestly, not that I'm aware of. I think there might be people who are harvesting these animals for meat, but a lot of how it seems to be going is still more on the sport or trophy hunting side.
And the second thing was, we just spoke just before we opened up the meeting, and we were talking about the fact that the outfitter that killed the female cougar who had 2 cubs would have had to have been registered to take a group out. There would be a license involved, and yet no charges have ever been laid and no names released. Do you think that that is something we could foip?
I think that's worth considering. If the investigation has been closed, then yes, that should be something that we can FOIP. If it is still an active investigation, then they won't release any of that information. FOIP tends to take a really long time.
And how would we find out if the investigation is still open?
To be honest, the easiest way is to try and FOIP it.
I was just going to mention hunting trapping magazines. There's one called Alberta Outdoors, has a couple of retired fish and wildlife biologists who write for it.
Okay.
Not sure if they could be brought into it. One of the writers is Lauren Fitch. I'm sure if Lauren was a wildlife guy, he'd be writing on this sort of thing. There are several other retired biologists who've joined Lauren. One of them is Richard Quinlan, who worked mostly in Hinton area, but also in the south, and he's in Lethbridge.
I have worked with Lauren Fitch before.
Yeah. I can give you his email and his phone.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we can work that out after, but thanks.
Have you talked to any like environmental lawyers or anything like that just to sort of see if they would be interested? Because I actually have an old connection. I don't know if he'd remember me, but if he does, I'm going to reach out to him and see if he's interested, and maybe if he is, I'll pass his info along to Ali, who can get it to you, Ruiping. He focuses on international type things as well as domestic stuff happening. And I'm not sure, his particular interest has been the oceans, right? More so, which we don't have a whole lot of ocean in Alberta. But this might be something up his alley.
We have talked a little bit about that. It's tricky. We've spoken to a couple of lawyers, and there's a couple of angles that we might be able to approach this, but yeah, we'd have to figure out how to put the case together. And like I said, there's a lot else going on. Like, while I've been very focused on the wildlife file, but others at AWA have also been very focused on the coal file, which is something that we have a legal challenge for. Trying to put together the resources and the case and figure out how we can approach this. But again, good ideas, worth looking into and seeing what might work.
Sorry. Yeah, Kevin Van Tighem might be a good source as well. He posted an article on this just recently on his
Right.
Facebook, social media. So he's, I'm sure you're aware of Kevin. Yeah, he might be a good contact too. And Jay Honeyman, who was a warden in Kananaskis, who was the bear dog guy. Jay would certainly be able to give you some numbers.
I will just put this out there. I had a very up close and personal experience with a cougar when I first moved to Canada and was doing everything wrong. I was the idiot wearing black leather boots, black leather jacket, earbuds in, going up Cougar Creek in Canmore at midnight without a torch. Anyways, that wasn't the experience I had. It involved me wearing a sheepskin coat and limping. And anyways, that experience marked me tremendously. And for anybody who's really interested in cougars, which I am, there's a phenomenal book put out by, I think her name is Paula Hunter, actually, from BC. And she has written a book called The Cougar, Beautiful, Wild, and Dangerous. And she literally has spent years tracking every cougar attack and kill in North America. But it reads like a novel because she traces the early hunting in the States where they went out with dog groups and surrounded the cougar and literally clubbed the animal to death. And then she traces it to BC, where there were pioneer women who knew how to track better than men, and they had to track cougar to feed their children and do things like that. But her evidence base from every single report that she's been able to gather is that every single cougar kill or attack was of somebody under 5'4", and that could be a man who was leaning under a shelter for rain or something like that. And every single one was an ailing or elderly or starving cougar. And it was really, really extraordinary when she laid out the statistics over the last 100 years of recorded cougar attacks and kills and hunting. And I'm wondering, Ruiping, if you have anything to say about getting rid of the fear that people have of wildlife.
On cougars especially, the reason that hunting often increases conflict is that hunting, especially trophy hunting, tends to target the large dominant cougars, which means that all the weaker cougars, often the younger cougars, but sometimes, cougars that are not able to establish dominance, come in, and they don't know better than to go after livestock or easy targets. In response to the rest of your question, though, I think there's this misunderstanding in that people assume predators are the most dangerous, and they're really not. In fact, if you look at animal attack statistics, it's often the prey that are more likely to attack, that are in their own way skittish, and if you get too close to them, they're more likely to try and charge you. Predators usually leave people alone. There's maybe some exceptions with coyotes and small dogs, but for the most part, predators don't want to go after people. And I guess on how you get rid of that fear, I think some of it is just education, getting people out there, not out into cougar territory, but just out into wild spaces and trying to get them to appreciate, because I think a lot of people also lose that appreciation and respect when they're away from really wild areas. And I think it's connected. Predators specifically, yeah, I think a lot of it is education, showing people, things like statistics, how many attacks actually are there, and especially compared to like bison. And you're right, there needs to be a respect, but not necessarily a fear. And a lot of the time, we are going into their spaces too, right? Humans have taken up quite a lot of the earth, and so we're starting to push into the last few refuges of these large mammals.
Thank you so much, Ruiping. I'm delighted that you came to speak and outlined very clearly what is going on with the government regarding wildlife and hunting. And so I hope everybody who's here today shares this, gets people to watch. And if you're in Calgary area, go in and sign the petition or do the letter in with the petition form. And hopefully we can get some groups together to collaborate. It's been very hard on many levels because there's so many things going on. But I really appreciate the information that you brought us tonight. It's just fantastic, and it really does matter what we're doing on every avenue regarding wildlife and ecology. And Kim just had a really great comment. Kim, do you want to say your comment about cows?
It's true. So I watched Shark Water, which is the same kind of idea. I don't know if people know what Shark Water is. A Canadian documentary and made it anyway. Huge thing, but he talks about sharks, and he had a love of sharks, which is an apex predator in our oceans. But he talks about like people have this irrational fear, and for the amount of shark attacks that happen where people actually die are so few compared to cows. More people die by vending machines falling on them than they do by shark attacks or bear attacks or, it's quite silly when we think about it that way.
Thank you, Kim, for a bit of verity there, or levity. Ruiping, if you wouldn't mind just staying behind 2 minutes after we close. And thank you from all of us. And we really have to speak out for wildlife because they can't. And you've given us some really good ways of doing that now. And I hope that everybody does get on board with that petition and brainstorming about collaborations between groups to make our voices more powerful. So thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. Speaker series is taking a break for the next month, and then we will probably come back hoping for somebody who's going to speak on civil law, civil disability, and treaty law and constitutional law. And then we're hoping to find somebody to speak on disabilities and AISH and people at risk who are finding it really hard to live with what's going on. And also then we have, oh my goodness, Dr. Carla Peck on education in August. So if you'd like to be on the email list for upcoming and you haven't already put your name in, you can contact me about that. Thank you so much for coming. And I will bid everybody good night.